Welcome back to our Life Group Bible study in the book of 2 Corinthians. Tonight we're in chapter 12, so if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn there now. This is a very interesting chapter with some very memorable sections. I'm excited about looking into these sections. So let's go ahead and start with verse 1 and get right to it. This boasting will do no good, but I must go on. I will reluctantly tell about visions and revelations from the Lord. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body, but I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. This is the first very memorable section of this chapter. Everyone kind of remembers about the third heaven comment that Paul makes because it's just such a strange comment about what is he talking about, this vision, this revelation that he had, and whether he was in the body or out of the body. Well, understand in Jewish culture, the third heaven is referring to what we think of as heaven. So the first heaven for them was simply the sky, where you would see birds fly, where the clouds up in the sky. That is the heavens, the first heaven. The second heaven would be where the sun, moon, and stars, celestial bodies reside. And so the outer space is the second heaven. The third heaven for them is the spiritual realm. That is the realm of God, and that is that heaven. And so Paul is literally saying, I was caught up into heaven. And he's not sure if his spirit went to heaven or if even his physical body was actually brought up to heaven, but he knows that he experienced heaven. And he saw things there that were so amazing that he doesn't even know how to put them in human words. And he's not even allowed to put them in human words because they are not meant for this world. People are not meant to see what he saw in his lifetime. And this is a key component to Paul's ministry, I believe. So many of us want that Damascus Road experience or to be caught up in the third heaven, right? How awesome would that be? I'm very jealous of Paul in this situation. He experiences what heaven is like. And so he also has this experience with Damascus Road where God literally comes down and speaks to him directly in this bright light and knocks people off their horses and whatever, and speaks directly to Paul and tells Paul what he wants from his life. Isn't that what we all want? We want God to come down, speak to us directly. So one, we have the confirmation he is who he says he is. And then we have this encouragement of in telling us exactly what he wants us to do. We have direction. We all want these things. But Paul is the one that gets them. Why? Why is Paul the one that gets them? Well, God had a purpose for Paul that was very unique. I mean, he was going to be the minister of the gospel to the Gentiles, and he was going to endure persecution like no one else has ever experienced persecution. I mean, this guy was whipped multiple times. He was beaten with rods multiple times. He was imprisoned multiple times. He was shipwrecked multiple times. He was even stoned to death. I mean, this guy went through persecution like we just don't understand and will never experience. God knew that he was going to live this life. God knew what he was going to accomplish and how single-minded and devoted that Paul would be to the cause. And as a result, he starts his ministry off with the Damascus Road experience and this dazzling display of actually bringing him to heaven. And the point I want to pull from this is point number one. The secret to enduring persecution is believing God's promises. The secret to enduring persecution is believing God's promises. See, Paul had these experiences, and it instilled in him such a faith. Because how can you deny? I mean, you've been to heaven, all right? You've seen God speak to you directly. How can you deny that? You know it's true. And because Paul knew it was true and had these experiences as his foundation, he was able to experience so much more. Now, we might be jealous of Paul here, but understand that the only way you're going to have those Damascus Road experiences is if you are preparing yourself for the persecutions that Paul experienced. And I don't think many of us are willing to be that devoted. I don't think many of us want to put aside families and relationships and physical health and spiritual health because he was attacked spiritually and physically. I don't think many of us are willing to put ourselves out there for that level of persecution. But if you want to do great things from God, if you want to do those amazing things, kind of like the Paul level ministry type things, all you have to do is be willing to go through any experience that God is willing to put you through. And He will reveal himself in preparation for you doing great things and enduring persecution. You just have to be open, receptive to doing those things. And so I think it's very key for us to grab hold of this book and make sure we're focusing on the promises of God and truly believing them, speaking them into our lives, making sure that we are acknowledging God's movement in our lives, and that we know that we are saved. We know that heaven is awaiting us, and because He's awaiting us, and because we know that God's promises about being with us and help us have the right words when we are faced with persecution and faced with trials, and having that presence with us, if we hold on to those promises, we'll be able to endure anything for Christ's sake. That's the key. All right, let's keep on reading and see what else Paul has to say. Following up with verse 5. That experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. I will boast only about my weaknesses. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so, because I would be telling the truth. But I won't do it, because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God. So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Such a famous passage and such an awesome passage. This is a beautiful thing. And one of the points I want to pull from this is point number 2. The key to effective ministry is humility. The key to effective ministry is humility. And here, Paul is given a thorn in the flesh, and a lot of people debate about what this thorn in the flesh is. And I'm kind of confused by why there's such a heavy debate about this, because it kind of says that Satan, sent a messenger from Satan to torment him. Literally, I think that demonic influence was allowed to persecute Paul, trouble him, persecute him on a spiritual level. And so Paul, recognizing that this spiritual negativity that's in his life, asked God multiple times to remove it. And it seems like a good prayer. It seems like a prayer that God would want to honor and answer here. But in Paul's situation, because he experienced so much, the growth of so many churches, having so many accomplishments, seeing heaven, having the Damascus Road experience, because he had had all these things, he had to make sure that Paul did not get too arrogant and too boastful and too proud. And as a result, he allowed some trials in Paul's life, even a very serious one, in having a messenger from Satan persecute him. But it was through that kept Paul grounded and allowed God to continuously work through him. And I know I have mentioned it, a number of times before, my first divorce, and just the effect that it had on me. But I can't escape the fact of how it prepared me to be where I am today. I didn't realize how proud I was when I was in that first marriage. And I could recognize my arrogance on like the soccer field or the basketball court, because I love to talk trash. I love to give it a hard time. And I knew I was pretty good at sports. I knew I was pretty good at school and that kind of stuff. So I could have maybe recognized my arrogance to a certain degree there. What I did not see is just how arrogant I came across, judgmental of not having gone down past that other people are going down. I didn't have that rebellious experience growing up as a youth. And I escaped a lot of the sins that people were going down, the sexual sins and just the party crowd and all those kind of things. I'd stayed clean. I'd done things the right way. And it was just, it wasn't conscious in me, but the subconscious and the way I conducted myself, I gave off this vibe of I'm better than people, and that I wouldn't ever do anything that stupid or that foolish or that sinful. This is the way I came across, and people could not relate to me. Well, I go through the divorce experience, and it completely knocked me on my butt. I was a completely different person. Suddenly, I was the only person that was divorced in my circle of friends at the time. And so I went from having like everyone kind of looking up to me to being this, like I had the plague, and like everyone looked at what did he do wrong to have this experience of leading to divorce. And I felt worthless, and I felt unusable. And it was at that point where I felt useless and unusable that God asked me to enter full-time ministry. It was because all that pride left me and was filled in I finally had the humility foundation I needed to serve. One story that's very fascinating to me is the story of Gideon too. I mean, it is the perfect example of how much impact pride and humility can have on ministry work. Because it starts out with Gideon thinks he is the most worthless person in his tribe. He's like, I have the lowest tribe in all of Israel, and I am the least of all of my family, my clan. And he's sitting in the bottom of this hole, preparing food and hiding from the Midianites. And here he is, a man that is timid and weak and thinks very lowly of himself. And this is the man that God chooses. And it takes Gideon 3 miracles. God has to show him 3 signs before he's even willing to do what God has to say, because he doesn't have enough faith in himself. He had to know that God was completely with him because he felt himself completely worthless. And then God is able to defeat this entire army, which is 300 soldiers. So again, how can Gideon take the credit here? But what's fascinating is after that battle with the 300 soldiers, God allowed Gideon to rally the rest of the Israelite people in the army here and chase down the other soldiers that were not killed in battle. And so he chases them all over, and they get this great victory, and all these people see this great victory, and they hail Gideon as a hero. They hold him up on this pedestal, and Gideon's head gets big. And so they say, what can we give you? And he's like, okay, well, I'll take a portion of all the plunder that you had. And he takes their silver, the gold, and he makes this monument to his accomplishments. And that monument turns into an idol that people worship. And he gets this big head, and he starts marrying more wives, because that's what you do when you're kind of like a king type figure, or you're very famous back in this culture. That was a perk that you got, more wives. And so he has so many wives that he ends up having 70 sons. 70 sons. So who knows how many wives? You have to have, you think, at least 10, 15 wives to accomplish that, probably many more. And so he gets this big head, but because he allowed the people's heart to be turned away from God because of his arrogance, the next generation after Gideon dies, all 70 of his sons are murdered. All 70 of them are wiped out, and his legacy is destroyed because of pride. And so he was completely ineffective for God once he got proud. When he was humble, he was able to defeat an entire army with 300 men because he just said yes to God. And so that's the difference between humility and pride. And one other thing I want to pull from this section is point number 3, our weaknesses reveal God's strength. Our weaknesses reveal God's strength. And so here Paul is pointing out that, God tells them very clearly, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. This is so true. That's why we need to boast in our weaknesses. I love that modern day preaching has really evolved from 20, 30 years ago, even longer. And I know there were pastors that were doing it the right way, but it just seemed like it was so prevalent to come to church. And the vibe that you would get is that the pastors were holier than thou. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't stay completely above board. They didn't reveal their weaknesses. They spoke the word of God and challenged you. And so people coming in feeling bad about themselves, hopefully repenting, but they just there was this big gap between the pastor and the congregation. I don't think that is the case nearly as much. And I hope you don't ever see that here at Renovation Church. And I don't think you will with me and Pastor Jeremy speaking a lot of times, because we both are pretty prevalent in sharing our weaknesses and our flaws and our mistakes. And that's valuable. That's useful. So people can see that we're relatable. It's not like we're living some different type of life. No, we've made as many mistakes as you have, if not more. And so showing our weaknesses, coupled with the fact that we're in a position of authority, of spiritual authority, and have been asked in the full-time ministry and Pastor Jeremy to lead a church, lead life groups and different things like that. The fact that God would call us into that despite the mistakes that we made shows the power of God. Clearly it's not us. Clearly it's not our abilities. Clearly it's God working through us, because we've made just as many mistakes as anyone. And so that's what Paul is showing here. Look, he's like, I killed Christians. I imprisoned Christians. I was an enemy of Christ, but because Christ's working through me, look at what I have accomplished. It's not me, it's all him. And so when Paul is like, and when I experience weakness, this thorn in the flesh, the inability to speak effectively at times, those kind of things, when I get beaten and persecuted and seem helpless according to the world, when I'm able to accomplish things and still lead people to Christ and still endure this persecution, Christ is revealed. The strength of Christ is revealed. All right, let's finish up this chapter, though. I'm going to read a long section here, 11 through 21 to the end. But let's read with verse 11. You have made me act like a fool, boasting like this. You ought to be writing commendations for me, for I am not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing at all. When I was with you, I certainly gave you proof that I am an apostle, for I patiently did many signs and wonders and miracles among you. The only thing I failed to do, which I do in other churches, was to become a financial burden to you. Please forgive me for this wrong. Now I am coming to you for the third time, and I will not be a burden to you. I don't want what you have. I want you. After all, children don't provide for their parents. Rather, parents provide for their children. I will gladly spend myself in all I have for you, even though it seems that the more I love you, the less you love me. Sure, there are a lot of parents out there echoing those words. Isn't that how it feels sometimes to be a parent? You pour in all this love, and then you just don't seem to get it in return. And it's just like the more you love them, the less they seem to love you. But that's period and seasons that they have to go through. One day, I truly believe that most of our kids, if not all of them, will recognize just how much we love them. But there's going to be times where they go through situations, especially in the teenage years, where you're just going to deal with this fact. And that's what Paul is dealing with. He's pouring out his love to the church of Corinth, and they're just not getting it. They're actually resentful. Some of you admit I was not a burden to you, but others still think I was sneaky and took advantage of you by trickery. But how? Did any of the men I sent to you take advantage of you? When I urged Titus to visit you and send our other brother with him, did Titus take advantage of you? No, for we have the same spirit and walk in each other's steps, doing the things the same way. Perhaps you think we're saying these things just to defend ourselves. No, we tell you this as Christ's servants, and with God as our witness. Everything we do, dear friends, is to strengthen you. For I am afraid that when I come, I won't like what I find, and you won't like my response. I am afraid that I will find quarreling, jealousy, anger, selfishness, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorderly behavior. Yes, I'm afraid that when I come again, God will humble me in your presence, and I will be grieved because many of you have not given up your old sins. You have not repented of your impurity, sexual immorality, and eagerness for lustful pleasure. Here again, in the last few chapters, this is what Paul is doing. Paul is trying to correct the church in Corinth. He's trying to correct these people and get them back on the right track. But what the church of Corinth is doing is some of the people in there with the hard hearts are turning it back on Paul and questioning his motives and saying he's not who he says he is and that he is actually doing this for profit or for the wrong motives. And this is the point I want to pull from this, and I think this has a broader application. But those living in sin often question the motives of those who try to correct sin. Those living in sin often question the motives of those who try to correct sin. This is actually a very common practice in cults. One in particular that comes to mind is Jehovah's Witnesses strongly condition their followers to question the motives of anyone that questions their religion. And I dealt with this firsthand. I had a couple of kids that I taught at a middle school, and I would invite them over and play games with them and hang out with them. And I knew they were Jehovah's Witnesses, but I tried to open dialogue about what they believed and what they thought. And they were pretty open to receiving things at first, but they would take their questions back to their teachers, and then they'd come back and they would be way more skeptical the next time and way more closed off. And as I would share stuff, they would keep questioning my motives, which was so strange to me because I donated so much of my time for these kids. I mean, I was spending Saturday afternoons playing video games with them when I had a million other things to do. I was their coach, and I coached soccer at the school for a pittance. I mean, I worked basically for nothing. And I invested so much time and energy in these people. It was like, what would be my motive? Like, I truly believe that what I'm sharing with you is the truth. I have no ulterior motive, but they are conditioned and trained that when time they're asked a question, they're supposed to immediately think, Why are they asking this question? What's the motive behind it? What are they trying to do? How are they trying to manipulate me? Which is so fascinating because that's what's being done to them by that church is they're being manipulated. But that is the first go-to of people that are living in sin and being corrected is Satan will say the same things. Why are they bringing this up to me? Why are they trying to challenge me? Why are they trying to correct my behavior? What's in it for them? They're just trying to make me look bad. They're just trying to make me look like a fool. They think they're better than me. They think I'm garbage. They think I'm worthless. And so immediately they start looking at somehow twisting it and making out that person is just trying to seem holier than thou and self-righteous and putting them down. That they're not doing it out of love. They're doing it out of some kind of emotional manipulation and trying to put them down. It stinks. It stinks to correct someone. It really does. And you're just going to have to put up with some of these things when you correct somebody. But God has called us to correct other believers. And when they are living in sin, we have got to do the hard thing and approach them with love and with grace, but correct them. Tell them this is not the way. And they're likely to get angry. And they're likely to turn it back on us and say, why are you treating me like this? What is your motive behind doing this? You're just trying to gossip and slander me about the church and all these. They'll accuse you of a million different things because their heart is hardened and they don't want to change. But hopefully you'll be planting seeds. And sometimes maybe they'll be immediately receptive, but even if they're not immediately receptive, hopefully they'll think about it and they'll recognize that there is no other motivation. It's not fun to correct somebody. You're not getting anything out of it other than putting them back on the right track. But the enemy comes and tries to question motives. That's just something you have to deal with. And I want you to recognize that if someone comes to you and corrects your behavior, corrects some kind of sin problem in your life, I hope you'll be receptive of it. I hope you won't buy into the enemy's lies and start questioning the motives of this person and questioning their love for you and their devotion for you. Because these people are doing it to Paul. Paul, who sacrificed his life and poured it out as an offering to Christ. Paul, who went through all kinds of persecutions. They're questioning Paul. So this human tendency is very real and can be affected by anybody. And so make sure that your heart is guarded and that you're willing to be corrected and being willing to listen and receive correction and not question motives right away. Think about it. Pray about it. If the person is correcting you is just in the wrong and they're correcting you of something that you really don't have a problem with, then great. Let that be between you and God, but be open to receiving that correction. And don't be afraid of giving correction to somebody else because that is a sign of love. All right, that's all I have for you for Chapter 12. We will be in Chapter 13 next week, which is the final chapter. Excited about wrapping up this series. Hope to see you next week.